The date was March 1st, 2012. The place was Rochester, New York. Eastman Kodak released a quiet announcement to a market that had already moved on. They were discontinuing Ektachrome. This was not a minor catalog adjustment, it was an execution. 3 distinct lines of professional color reversal film were erased. The company itself had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy just 6 weeks earlier, drowning in billions of debt. The massive network of independent E6 photo labs, businesses that once turned around film in an hour for demanding art directors, was already in terminal collapse. The photographers paid the price. Studio shooters froze their remaining stock. Magazine editorial desks lost the medium that had fed their printing presses for decades. Families realized the slide projector was now a dead tongue. The paradox was absolute. Ektachrome still worked perfectly. The film still reproduced reality with startling 3-dimensional clarity. But the market no longer wanted what it represented. The world had chosen instant pixels over chemical patience. But the real story of Ektachrome is not the story of a 2012 bankruptcy. It is the story of a physical ecosystem of light and trust, and how it unraveled when the unalterable image became inconvenient. Every week, we tell the stories of the cameras, lenses, films, factories, stores, labs, and repair benches that once taught people how to see, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in a military reconnaissance laboratory in 1944. In the middle of the Second World War, the United States military had a logistical crisis in the Pacific Theater. They needed color photographs of enemy territory, and they needed them immediately. At the time, the absolute gold standard for color photography was Kodachrome. But Kodachrome was a maddeningly complex invention. It was essentially a black and white film that had the cyan, magenta, and yellow color dyes added one by one during a proprietary, highly calibrated development sequence. You could not develop Kodachrome in a jungle tent. It required a massive continuous processing machine housed in a dedicated facility, run by highly trained chemical engineers. In peacetime, an amateur photographer could accept dropping a roll in the mail and waiting 2 weeks for their vacation memories to return. In a theater of war, a 2-week wait meant the battlefield had already shifted. The military demanded a color film that a solitary technician could process in the field. Eastman Kodak's scientists in Rochester, New York, answered with a product called Ektachrome. The chemical architecture was fundamentally different from Kodachrome. Instead of adding dyes later, Kodak engineered the color couplers, the chemical compounds that form color dyes when they react with a developer, directly into the emulsion. The emulsion, the microscopically thin, light-sensitive chemical layer coated onto the film base, now contained everything needed to produce color. For the first time, a military reconnaissance unit could fly a mission, land, and hand the exposed rolls to a technician in a makeshift darkroom, a light-controlled space where film is developed. Using a relatively straightforward sequence of chemical baths, that technician could produce full-color positive transparencies in hours, not weeks. The physical object provided immediate, undeniable proof of a target's location. When the war ended, Kodak recognized the immense commercial power of what they had built. In 1946, they introduced Ektachrome to the civilian market. It arrived in an America entering an era of unprecedented economic expansion. The advertising industry was exploding. Magazines like Life, Vogue, and National Geographic were desperate for vivid, high-quality color images. But professional studio photographers faced a severe bottleneck. If a New York fashion shooter photographed a campaign on Kodachrome, they immediately lost physical control of their work. The film had to be placed in a yellow envelope and mailed to a Kodak processing plant. The photographer could not check their exposure. The art director could not select the best frame. If a magazine needed a cover shot printed by Friday, sending film into a mail order void was a logistical nightmare. Ektachrome offered professional autonomy. Released initially as sheet film for large format 4x5 and 8x10 cameras, and soon after in 120 and 620 roll formats, it was a slide film. Slide film, film that produces a positive transparency instead of a negative, changed the physical workflow of the studio. When a photographer shot negative film, the light and dark values were reversed, and the colors appeared inverted. It required a second step, printing onto photographic paper through an enlarger to see the actual image. But a positive transparency was the final image. You held the heavy sheet of acetate up to a window or laid it on a glowing light box, and the photograph was there, exactly as the lens had seen it. It was absolute. Because Kodak sold the chemical kits directly to the public, Ektachrome bypassed the massive Kodak factory entirely. Independent photo labs, specialized businesses that developed film for working professionals, began to emerge in major media markets. By the early 1950s, using iterations known as Process E1 and later E2, a new rhythm was established in the commercial photography industry. A studio in Manhattan could shoot a car advertisement at 9 o'clock in the morning. They could hand the exposed sheets of Ektachrome to a bicycle courier who delivered them to a local independent lab. The lab technicians would load the film onto stainless steel hangers and lower them into deep tanks of precisely heated chemicals in total darkness. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the courier was back at the studio with dry, brilliant, full-color transparencies. This speed was revolutionary. The independent lab network became a shadow infrastructure supporting the publishing industry. Camera stores across the country began to dedicate prime shelf space to the distinctive yellow boxes with the blue lettering. Ektachrome was not as fine-grained as Kodachrome, and its colors were different, often leaning toward a cooler, more realistic palette rather than Kodachrome's legendary warmth. But the trade-off was worth it. A professional photographer could bill their client the same day they shot the assignment. The first crack in Kodachrome's absolute dominance had appeared, and it was engineered by Kodak itself. Yet the system was far from perfect. The early processing methods, process E2, E3, and E4, were highly toxic, temperamental, and slow by modern standards. The chemicals required aggressive ventilation. If a lab technician allowed the temperature of the color developer to drift by a single degree, the chemical balance collapsed, and a fashion model's skin tone might render as a sickly green. A box of professional sheet film was an expensive investment, and ruining a client's shoot in the darkroom was a constant financial risk. The market had embraced the idea of local color processing, but it needed a standardized, bulletproof system. It needed a chemical language that any lab in the world could speak fluently without constant fear of destroying the physical image. The film had found its market. The market had not yet revealed its definitive form. The breakthrough arrived in 1976. It was not a new camera body. It was not a revolutionary lens mount. It was a rigorous industrial sequence. Kodak introduced Process E6. Before 1976, developing Ektachrome required older chemical sequences known as Process E3 and E4. These systems were toxic, highly regulated, and incredibly temperamental. They relied on hazardous reversal agents, and if a lab technician allowed the temperature to drift by even a single degree, the chemical balance collapsed. A fashion portrait might come out with a sickly green cast, or a bright blue sky might render as a muddy purple. The professional market had embraced the idea of local color processing, but it needed a bulletproof system. It needed a chemical language that any lab in the world could speak fluently, with repeatable, absolute precision. Process E6. The standardized sequence of chemical baths required to turn exposed acetate into a color-positive transparency changed the photographic industry overnight. It was a masterpiece of chemical engineering. E6 condensed the workflow into 6 specific baths: running at a high, strictly controlled temperature of exactly 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The sequence was physically demanding, but it was fast. First, the exposed film went into the first developer, a black and white chemical that formed a negative silver image in the emulsion. Then came the reversal bath, a chemical fogging agent that prepared the remaining unexposed silver to be turned into a positive. The third step was the color developer, which finally activated the color couplers built into the film itself, generating cyan, magenta, and yellow dyes. After a pre-bleach, a bleach bath to remove the silver, and a final fixer to stabilize the image, the film was washed and hung to dry. What used to take hours of wet time and dangerous handling was reduced to a standardized cycle of under 40 minutes. With the introduction of the E6 process, Kodak released a new generation of Ektachrome films, specifically engineered for the chemistry. The professional standards became Ektachrome 64 and Ektachrome 200. The numbers referred to the ISO rating, the measure of the film's sensitivity to light. An ISO of 200 was considered remarkably fast for color-positive film at the time, allowing photographers to shoot in lower light or use faster shutter speeds to freeze action. The price context was steep. In the late 1970s, a roll of 36 exposure Ektachrome cost around $4.50, and professional E6 lab processing added another $3 to $4 per roll. Compared to cheap, consumer-grade color negative film dropping at local pharmacies, shooting Ektachrome was a heavy expense. A commercial studio could easily burn hundreds of dollars on film and chemistry in a single afternoon. But for professionals, the cost was irrelevant compared to the control it offered. It bought time and it bought certainty. The closest competitor was still Kodachrome, running on its proprietary K14 process. Kodachrome remained sharper, nearly grainless, and boasted legendary archival stability. But Kodachrome was a closed loop. Kodak tightly controlled the massive K14 processing machines. The distribution breakthrough of Ektachrome was its total decentralization. Kodak did not keep E6 a secret. The process was openly licensed. Kodak sold the chemistry in massive commercial jugs, but so did bitter competitors like Fujifilm and Agfa. Because anyone could buy the chemistry, any professional camera store with backroom space could install an E6 line. In major media markets, independent photo labs built massive business models around the process. Facilities like Dougal Visual Solutions in New York installed towering dip and dunk processors. These were heavy mechanical rigs that automatically clipped exposed strips of Ektachrome to hangers, lowering them into deep, temperature-controlled vats of chemistry, moving them from tank to tank with a steady, industrial rhythm. The transparency became the standardized currency of the visual world. When a photographer shot a roll of Ektachrome, the lab machine cut the individual frames and snapped them into slide mounts. The slide mount, a small 2x2-inch frame made of thin cardboard or plastic, changed how photographs were handled and consumed. For families and amateur camera clubs, the slideshow became a sensory ritual. The lights went down. The cooling fan of a Kodak Carousel 850 projector began its steady, metallic hum. The heavy plastic rotary tray clicked into place. A 300-watt halogen bulb fired, pushing intense light through a piece of transparent plastic, throwing a massive, luminous image onto a living room wall. You could smell the dust burning off the hot bulb and the faint, distinct scent of heated acetate. But for commercial professionals, the unmounted transparency was something far more severe. It was absolute. Negative film required a darkroom printer to interpret the colors and adjust the exposure under an enlarger. A slide required no interpretation. What you held up to the light was exactly what the lens saw. If a photographer missed the exposure by half a stop, the slide was too dark or too light, and the frame was ruined. Transparency film demanded brutal technical discipline from the person holding the camera. Because it was absolute, it became the mandatory standard for the global printing industry. When Sports Illustrated needed to print a high-speed football photograph, or when National Geographic went to press with a wildlife feature, their editorial desks demanded positive slides. The massive color separation drum scanners used by catalog publishers and magazines were calibrated specifically for the density and color response of positive film. Ektachrome had achieved something rare in the history of industrial design. It had become invisible. Photographers and art directors no longer thought about the film. They only thought about the reality it captured. The breakthrough had locked in. The transparency was no longer just a physical object. It was the undisputed baseline of professional truth. But to understand the true weight of this system, you have to look at the rooms where that truth was judged. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ektachrome was no longer just a photographic product. It was a physical environment. To understand the absolute scale of its dominance in the American market, you have to look away from the camera itself and look at the spaces where the photographs ended up. Walk into the editorial offices of Vogue, Time, or National Geographic in 1992. The desks were not dominated by computer monitors. They were dominated by light tables. A light table? A flat, translucent, frosted acrylic surface, illuminated from below by daylight-calibrated 5,000 Kelvin fluorescent tubes, was the arena where commercial photography lived and died. Photographers would return from assignments and deliver thick, clear plastic sleeves holding rows of 35mm or medium-format transparencies. The photo editor would lay these sheets flat on the glowing white surface. The editor would lean in with a loupe, a small, dense, highly corrected optical magnifying glass placed directly onto the film, and inspect the frames one by one. The tension in those editorial rooms was entirely physical. A red grease pencil would circle the chosen frame directly on the plastic sleeve. That single, unique piece of acetate, the actual physical emulsion that was present in the camera when the shutter fired, was carefully pulled from the sleeve. There was no backup. There was no raw file stored on a hard drive. If a courier lost the envelope on the way to the printing press, the image ceased to exist. The object was the art. At its peak, Eastman Kodak was producing millions of square feet of Ektachrome every year. The manufacturing process in Rochester, New York, was a marvel of industrial scale operating in total darkness. Inside Building 38 at Kodak Park, massive coating machines, some the size of a city block, ran continuous webs of clear acetate base. In a strictly climate-controlled environment, microscopic layers of silver halide crystals and color-forming chemical couplers were laid down with pharmaceutical precision. The coating had to be perfectly even. A variation of a fraction of a millimeter would result in visible color shifts across a roll. The brand was sold everywhere, from the massive multi-story floors of B&H Photo Video in Manhattan, where professionals bought 50-roll bricks of identical emulsion batches, to small-town pharmacies in the American Midwest. But the true power of Ektachrome lay in its specialized fragmentation. Kodak continuously refined the formula, creating an entire catalog of hyper-specific emulsions designed for exact professional needs. There was Ektachrome 64 Professional, EPR, heavily prized by catalog shooters and product photographers for its neutral color balance. A white shirt in a studio remained perfectly white. There was Ektachrome Panther, designed to push highly saturated colors to compete with Fujifilm's aggressively vibrant Velvia line. There was high-speed Ektachrome 400 for sports shooters working under the terrible artificial lights of indoor arenas. There was even Ektachrome Infrared, a bizarre and highly specialized film originally designed for military camouflage detection. It rendered healthy green foliage in surreal, glowing shades of crimson, becoming a favorite of experimental artists and album cover designers. These specialized films filled the metal camera cases of professionals worldwide. When a photographer for the Black Star Photo Agency was dispatched to cover a political convention, their bag was packed with yellow boxes. When Sports Illustrated sent a team to the Super Bowl, the sidelines were a sea of motorized cameras burning through Ektachrome, simply because the magazine's pre-press systems demanded the absolute color truth of a positive slide. Supporting this massive output was a shadow economy of processing power. The E6 lab network had become an industrial force of its own. In major media centers like New York and Los Angeles, professional photo labs never slept. Facilities like Dougal Visual Solutions in Manhattan and A&I Photographic in Hollywood operated 24 hours a day. This created a frantic physical rhythm to the city. Bicycle messengers crisscrossed Manhattan traffic, carrying waterproof bags filled with exposed film from fashion studios to the labs. At the lab, technicians worked in dark rooms, stripping the film from cassettes and splicing them onto massive leader cards for the continuous processing machines. The air was thick with the distinct metallic smell of the bleach and fixer baths. A busy commercial lab might process thousands of rolls of Ektachrome in a single shift. The technicians maintained their deep chemical vats with rigorous testing, running control strips, pre-exposed pieces of film provided by Kodak, through the machines every few hours. They would read the resulting densities with an electronic densitometer. If the chemistry was even slightly exhausted, or the temperature drifted from 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, they added highly concentrated replenishers. A photographer dropping off film on a Tuesday morning expected the exact same color response as a photographer dropping off film on a Friday midnight. This system was so robust that it eventually spawned its own rebel subculture. In the 1990s, the fashion and music video industries began deliberately breaking the rules of the chemistry. Photographers took Ektachrome film and explicitly instructed the labs to develop it in C41 chemicals, the entirely different process engineered for color-negative film. This technique, known as cross-processing, was a chemical violation. It produced wild, uncorrectable results, extreme blown-out contrast, aggressively shifted color balances, bright yellow highlights, and deep, grainy, cyan-tinted shadows. It became the defining visual aesthetic of 1990s grunge culture and high-fashion magazines like The Face. The Ektachrome emulsion was so physically thick and brilliantly engineered that it could survive and thrive even when the fundamental laws of its chemistry were actively subverted. This was the absolute peak of the medium. The entire visual publishing industry of the 20th century rested on these tiny squares of plastic. Imagine the midpoint stakes on a Thursday evening in the Condé Nast building. A cover shoot for a major fashion publication is just wrapped. Tens of thousands of dollars have been spent on models, styling, lighting, and studio time. All of that investment, all of that effort, is locked inside latent, invisible chemical changes on a thin strip of acetate. The film is rushed to the lab. For 40 minutes, it is completely out of the photographer's control, submerged in near boiling chemicals. When it emerges, it will either be a masterpiece or it will be ruined. If this film disappeared, America would not simply lose another yellow box on a camera store shelf. It would lose the chemical language through which professional truth, editorial decisions, and exact color reality became unalterable physical memory. In 1996, Kodak seemed invincible. The E6 ecosystem was printing money, the independent lab network was deeply entrenched, and the slide projector still commanded the corporate boardroom and the family living room. The brand looked strongest at the exact moment its weakness became structural. The decline of Ektachrome did not begin with a catastrophic bankruptcy, nor did it begin with the invention of the digital camera. The first small crack appeared in a place the photographer rarely saw, the magazine pre-press room. It began with technology displacement. In the mid to late 1990s, high-end commercial drum scanners, massive spinning cylinders equipped with incredibly sensitive photomultiplier tubes, became deeply integrated with early versions of Macintosh computers and Adobe Photoshop. For 50 years, the fundamental rule of commercial photography was that a positive slide was absolute. But when a pre-press technician mounted a piece of Ektachrome onto a Heidelberg drum scanner, that physical absolute was suddenly transformed into fluid digital data. If a photo editor could scan an Ektachrome transparency and fix a slight underexposure, shift a color balance, or remove a blemish on a monitor before the magazine went to the printing press, then the unforgiving precision of transparency film was no longer strictly mandatory. Photographers and art directors quickly realized that color-negative film, which had a much wider exposure latitude and was drastically cheaper to process, could be scanned and digitally inverted with nearly identical, highly controllable results. The professional necessity of the positive slide, the very reason Ektachrome dominated the commercial studio, began to quietly erode. The physical object was losing its absolute authority. Simultaneously, a second force struck the amateur and institutional markets: cultural habit collapse. The slide projector, once a staple of the American living room, the university lecture hall, and the corporate boardroom, began to gather dust. Families realized that pointing a Sony Handycam at a birthday party and recording onto magnetic tape was infinitely easier than paying for slide film, paying for E6 processing, setting up a specialized screen, and plunging a room into darkness. In schools and businesses, the heavy mechanical Kodak carousels were unplugged, replaced by early, low-resolution digital projectors running Microsoft PowerPoint. The cultural habit of viewing images by shining an intense, hot light through a piece of physical plastic simply vanished. But the most devastating blow to the Ektachrome ecosystem was a hidden structural failure taking place deep within Kodak's own balance sheets. It was a brutal case of cross-market collapse. The sprawling 24-hour E6 lab ecosystem was, in reality, a luxury. It was a specialized, low-volume professional service that was secretly subsidized by a completely different market. Kodak's massive chemical manufacturing division in Rochester was kept highly profitable by millions of ordinary families dropping off cheap, 35mm point-and-shoot color negative film at local drugstores and one-hour photo kiosks. That consumer C41 process generated rivers of cash, allowing Kodak to maintain the massive infrastructure needed to produce the niche, highly complex E6 chemistry for professionals at a reasonable price. When the consumer market rapidly shifted to early digital cameras like the Canon PowerShot in the early 2000s, that river of cash abruptly dried up. Millions of rolls vanished from the drugstore counters. Without the massive volume of consumer film to subsidize the chemical factories in New York, the cost of manufacturing niche E6 chemistry skyrocketed. Price compression set in with a vengeance. The price of a single roll of professional Ektachrome E100G crept toward $10, then $15, plus the rapidly rising cost of independent lab processing. For photojournalists and studio shooters transitioning to the first truly viable professional digital SLRs, the Nikon D1 in 1999 and the Canon EOS 1D in 2001, the math was brutal, immediate, and undeniable. The digital sensor, an electronic surface that records light and instantly translates it to a reusable compact flash card, changed the basic economy of the shutter. Digital was free to shoot. You could fire a 10-frame-per-second burst at a football game, look at the screen on the back of the camera, and transmit the file over a phone line to an editor in minutes. Film cost money every single time the mechanical shutter curtain crossed the focal plane. Ektachrome, once prized specifically for its speed of delivery, suddenly looked painfully, agonizingly slow. As the professional volume of Ektachrome plummeted, the industry was hit by the final, fatal force: service and repair collapse. Process E6 chemistry is highly volatile. It is an industrial system that requires constant, heavy volume to remain chemically stable. If a professional photo lab does not run enough rolls of film through the machine every single day, the chemical baths begin to oxidize. The color developer degrades. If the chemistry goes bad, it ruins the film, casting a sickening yellow or deep blue tint over the photographer's work. To keep the chemistry alive when volume was low, lab technicians had to manually dump gallons of expensive chemical replenishers into the vats. The giant dip and dunk machines, the mechanical rigs that moved the film from tank to tank, required massive amounts of electricity to heat the deep liquid baths to exactly 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 hours a day, regardless of whether they processed 500 rolls or 5 rolls. Lab owners looked at their ledgers. The math was impossible. The machines were losing money every hour they remained turned on. One by one, the professional labs shut down their E6 lines. The deep tanks were drained. The stainless steel hangers were sold for scrap. This created an inescapable death spiral. Photographers who still explicitly wanted the Ektachrome look, who still valued the physical discipline of the slide, suddenly found they had nowhere local to develop it. If you lived in a mid-sized American city, the 1-hour professional lab was gone. You had to seal your exposed film in a FedEx envelope, mail it to a specialized facility in Los Angeles or New York, and wait a week for it to return. The very advantage that had allowed Ektachrome to conquer the commercial market in the 1950s, local, rapid, autonomous processing, had been completely, systematically erased. The system dismantled itself piece by piece. The camera stores moved the yellow boxes from the massive refrigerated main displays to a small, warm shelf in the back of the room. The commercial distributors stopped ordering the 50-roll Pro Packs. The magazine editorial desks sold their glowing light tables, replacing them with calibrated dual-monitor computer setups. By the late 2000s, Eastman Kodak was in full retreat, a company violently shedding its physical heritage to survive a digital transition it had initially invented but failed to dominate. They began aggressively discontinuing niche formats of Ektachrome. Large format 8x10 and 4x5 sheet film went first, cutting off the high-end landscape and catalog shooters. Then went specific ISO speeds. Then went the infrared variants. In 2009, Kodak officially killed Kodachrome, an event that made global headlines and signaled the end of the slide era. Ektachrome survived that cull, but it was merely a ghost living inside a hollowed-out system. The giant acetate coating machines in Building 38, designed to run miles of film in total, climate-controlled darkness, were wildly inefficient when forced to produce small boutique batches for a shrinking handful of die-hard professionals. The chemicals cost more to mix than the market was willing to pay. On March 1, 2012, the final execution arrived. Eastman Kodak, bleeding cash, drowning in legacy debt, and restructuring under Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, announced the cancellation of all remaining color reversal films. Ektachrome E100G, E100VS, and Elite Chrome were erased from the world. The decision was absolute. There was no reprieve, no licensed continuation, no buyer for the specialized formulas. The physical language of the color positive had simply become too expensive to speak. The catalog changed. The dealer stopped ordering. The volume plummeted. The machine oxidized. The vats were drained. The lab closed. The light table went dark. The film stopped. The camera remained. The market moved on. If the story ended on that March day in 2012, Ektachrome would be nothing more than a memory, a victim of the digital revolution, relegated to the dusty shelves of camera collectors and the expired film bins of eBay auctions. For years, photographers who still craved the transparency hoarded their frozen stock of E100G. They watched the prices of expired rolls climb to $20, then $30 on the secondary market. But shooting expired. Ektachrome was a gamble. As the chemical couplers aged in the emulsion, the film lost its legendary precision, yielding aggressive magenta color shifts and heavy base fog. The medium was literally decaying in the freezer. But 6 years later, something impossible happened. In 2018, Eastman Kodak and Kodak Alaris, the spin-off company managing Kodak's film distribution, announced the commercial return of Ektachrome E100. It was not a simple manufacturing reboot. They could not just locate the old recipe book and flip a switch in the factory. The original 1990s chemicals relied on compounds that now violated modern environmental regulations, and the original suppliers of the raw materials had long since gone out of business. Kodak's scientists had to effectively reverse engineer their own invention, formulating entirely new chemical pathways to recreate the exact color dyes that defined the film's golden era. The physical side of production had also changed permanently. The giant, city block-sized continuous coating machines in Building 38 at Kodak Park in Rochester, the ones that used to run miles of acetate in total darkness, were far too massive to be economically viable. Instead, Kodak fired up a smaller, highly specialized pilot coating facility. They rebuilt the supply chain to operate on a scale that made sense for a boutique market. Who is buying a new $20 roll of Ektachrome today? It is bought by a new generation of film photographers, cinematographers, and hybrid shooters. They walk into specialized retailers like B&H Photo Video in New York, or order it from local analog revival shops. They load it into fully mechanical Leica rangefinders, battered Nikon F3S, and Canon AE1S. This is not nostalgia. It is a deliberate rejection of digital elasticity. In the modern professional workflow, a digital RAW file, an unprocessed electronic dataset capturing maximum dynamic range, is infinitely malleable. It is a suggestion. An editor can shift the white balance, pull details out of pure shadow, or completely alter the reality of the scene hours, days, or years after the shutter actually fired. A frame of Ektachrome is a decision. It offers a brutal, uncompromising discipline that digital convenience destroyed. Because positive slide film has barely any exposure latitude, it forces the photographer to rigorously understand exactly how light is behaving in the physical world. If you overexpose Ektachrome by one stop, the highlights are blown out permanently, leaving clear, empty plastic. Once the focal plane shutter curtain closes, the exposure is locked into the chemical emulsion. There is no recovery slider. When modern hybrid shooters scan a new E100 transparency using a high-end digital mirrorless camera or a commercial flatbed scanner, they are extracting the absolute physical truth of a difficult medium and blending it with modern digital distribution. The surprise footnote of Ektachrome's survival is that its existence is not anchored entirely by still photographers. The true industrial volume keeping the Rochester coating machines alive comes from Hollywood. When the director of photography for the HBO television series Euphoria wanted a specific, unreplicable, highly saturated visual texture for the show's second season, they did not simply rely on digital color grading software. They convinced Eastman Kodak to manufacture massive batches of 35mm Ektachrome motion picture film, and then deliberately cross-processed it in color-negative chemistry. The massive demand from the motion picture industry, from filmmakers shooting Super 8 16mm and 35mm formats, provides the financial foundation that ensures the 35mm still photography cassettes remain on the camera store shelves. The E6 Lab network has not returned to its 1990s scale. The 24-hour bicycle couriers rushing through Manhattan traffic are gone. But the service collapse has stabilized. A new decentralized network of boutique film labs has emerged across the United States. They have invested in brand new small batch rotary processing machines mixing fresh E6 chemistry to serve a market that has finally accepted the true cost of analog photography. The slide projector may be unplugged, gathering dust in a basement, but the fundamental desire to hold a photograph up to the light is not dead. Ektachrome reminds us that photography was never meant to be entirely frictionless. The friction, the high cost, the careful metering of light, the mechanical precision of the camera, the chemical weight, was exactly what gave the photograph its weight. In a quiet apartment above a noisy city street, a photographer pulls a freshly processed strip of 35mm Ektachrome out of a clear plastic archival sleeve. They do not turn on a computer monitor. They do not open a software application. They simply hold the heavy acetate strip up to the natural light of the window. The sunlight catches the emulsion, and suddenly the colors ignite. Vivid blues, rich reds, absolute, unalterable reality captured on a piece of plastic. They load a fresh cassette into a cold metal camera, hook the leader onto the take-up spool, and advance the lever, ready to divide the light into one more frame. See you in the next one.